In order to talk about resumes, we're first going to talk about applications. And what I've heard many, many times over the years from job seekers is, why on earth is the employer asking me to upload a resume that has my work history and my contact information and my education and my skills, and then ask me to complete an application that also asks for my work history and my contact information and my education and my skills? Are they being mean? Are they confused? What's going on? The reason for this is more that these two documents have different jobs. The application is a legal form created by the employer. The resume is a marketing document created by you. So, some very quick tips on applications. You want to make sure that you read through the instructions for the application because they're not all going to be the same, and as much of the application as possible just to see what you're going to be in for with this application. You won't always be able to see all of it at once, but it's helpful to look ahead as much as you can. You want to make sure you're giving yourself plenty of time. Depending on the application, there may be a section likely to put in your work history and education and so on. Depending on the type of position you're applying for, there might be an application assessment. And then you also want to allow time to target your resume, which we'll be talking about a whole lot today, and about getting your cover letter ready as well. So you don't want to put yourself in a position to have to rush because that is stressful. So when you're filling out the application, you want to make sure and fill out everything if you can. If something doesn't apply to you, then go ahead and put not applicable or NA in that field, but try not to leave anything blank because then the employer doesn't know, did you skip this one? Did you miss it? Is there an answer, but you didn't see the question? And so is it incomplete? What's going on? So if you put not applicable or NA, that makes it very clear. I see this question and it doesn't apply to me. I would also recommend reading the small print. Usually you'll find that toward the end of the application, and it'll often look like a great big block of text that just simply screams, I am very boring, please skip me. Don't do it. It's important to read the small print toward the end of the application because even if you're typing in your name, that will count as your signature. So you want to make sure that you know what you are agreeing to, what you're giving the employer permission to do with the information you're providing to them, and it's confirming the accuracy and truth of the information you provided. So make sure that you read through that. And finally, and this piece of advice has saved so many people so many headaches, and I hope that it will save some headaches for you too. Keep good records with your applications. Each employer, if you're applying directly through their website, which is what we recommend, then each employer is likely going to have you create at least a password, probably a username too. And if you're in an active job search, you may be filling out a whole lot of applications per day, per week, etc. And so it can help a lot whether you write it down or create a spreadsheet. Keep track of, on this date I applied with this company for this position, here's my username and password for that company. And anything else that might be helpful, like security questions and exactly how you typed your answers, that sort of thing. That can make life so much easier when you are in an active job search and trying to keep track of when you applied where and who's calling you and about what. So it also can be very helpful because a whole lot of time gets spent trying to remember what on earth was my password for this one. Did this require the special character or did this require the capital? So that can be a really helpful way to keep things all organized so that that's one less thing for you to have to stress about. Ultimately, you want to remember that the application is one of the first impressions that you'll leave with the employer. Often it is the only thing that they know about you at that point, and so it's important to try and make it as good an impression as possible. So let's get into the reason that many of you, I'm sure, are here and get into resumes. So, what the hope is coming out of this workshop is that you will feel comfortable and understand the key resume basics and basic resume sections. You'll know the importance of targeting your resume and what that looks like, and what an accomplishment statement is, and how you can use that to sell your skills on a resume. And finally, we're going to talk briefly, like I said, about the importance of a cover letter and the basic content to include. So if you were to talk to 5 people about their best resume advice, you would probably get at least 10 opinions about what makes a resume work, what makes the perfect resume. There is no exact formula. And the reason for that is that there are different things, different ways to go about it that are going to work for different people, depending on the type of work that you're looking into, the type of work history you already have, and the skills that you're bringing to the table. And so What I will be doing today and what Career Force staff at all the offices do is offer best practices and strategy advice, not necessarily a you must do it this way or all is lost. So keep that in mind as you are reading the suggestions below. The most important thing is that you are comfortable with your resume. You want it to be something that you feel confident in that represents you well. And so, as you're looking online or hearing different opinions from people, reading and researching about resume tips, you're bound to find conflicting advice. And when that happens, there are two important questions you want to make sure that you are asking. That one, is this advice directed toward somebody working in a certain industry or with a certain background? Is that a match with mine? I guess that's a two-part question. And then the second one is this what is right for me in my situation? So those are the important questions to ask yourself whenever you see resume advice, because sometimes it will be a perfect piece of advice if you're in that industry over there, but not necessarily for this industry over here. Ultimately, once you're confident with your resume, the only test for it is it generating interviews for positions you are interested in? If it's getting you interviews for positions that don't match what you're looking for or don't match your qualifications, it's not doing its job. And if it's not getting you interviews at all, it's definitely not doing its job. It's doing its job when it's getting you interviews for the positions you are interested in. So we have a cute little acrostic poem here about resumes, but ultimately it comes down to what should resumes be? If they can be so many different things and there are so few things that every single resume needs to have, what do good resumes tend to have in common? Here's what they do. Resumes, generally, you want them to be a review of your qualifications for the position or occupation you're applying into. And that's an important key detail there. If someone walks up to you and says, "Tell me your qualifications," a very reasonable next question might be, qualifications for what? For juggling? For performing heart surgery? For driving a Mack truck? For what? And that's something to keep in mind with your resume as well. You want it to review your qualifications for a position rather than going up and saying, "Here are my qualifications for everything." Good luck. Because that's a lot of work for the employer sometimes to figure out how your qualifications match what they're looking for. And when it's a lot of work, sometimes they will move on to someone else. So you want to keep it focused. And that's what a lot of these pieces of advice will come back to, keeping things focused. So, in the spirit of keeping things focused, you want to make sure that you're including the essential information only on your resume. It's a marketing tool. You want to focus it on what will make sense to tell the employer to show them how you're a good fit for the position. Not necessarily everything, not necessarily your entire work history. It's skills based. And when I say skills based, think about it as opposed to task based. Because when you have a task-based resume, that's where you are seeing things like this. These are the things that were in my job description. These are the things that were assigned to me. And that may be quite true. However, it doesn't say very much about how you did that work, what you brought to the table, why things were made better because you were the one doing that job. And so when you focus it on being skills based, that's where you're focusing on your accomplishments, using the skills that made you good at your job. So that really helps the employer paint a clearer picture of what you might bring to the table for them. Ultimately, you want it to focus on what makes you unique, what sets you apart. If you are focusing on tasks, someone else might have done that same job and they probably did a lot of the same tasks. What sets you apart? Once again, what will you be bringing to the table that is unique to you? Because ultimately you're marketing yourself and you want to draw the employer's attention, excuse me, to the best skills and qualifications that match the job posting. And we'll talk about that in a little bit about formatting and how you can use the format to sort of move a spotlight around to the areas of your skills and work history that are the most appealing for a given position. An effective resume gets you interviews, like we said, and it's effective when it's easy to read, when it has a nice appearance, it's targeted, it's a quick read. You don't want it to be paragraphs and paragraphs. And finally, again, keeping it focused, specific. You want it to show the employer you're the best fit for their position. So rather than using your resume to answer the question, what are your skills and qualifications and work history, use it to answer the question, how well do you match this position? And when you make that shift, then suddenly the resume becomes much more targeted, much more focused and much more effective for a given position. So some quick basics about resumes that we've talked a little bit about keeping it focused. It's not a complete history. It's just a preview. Think of it like a movie trailer. You want to get the employer interested and wanting to know more and willing to invest some time. And so you want it to be a quick and easy read with clear sections. You want to make sure that you are utilizing things like bullet points. You don't want it to look like an essay because essays tend to be a little harder for our brain to focus on for a long period of time. And a lot of times recruiters don't have a long period of time. And so you want to make sure that it's something that they can look through quickly and kind of go check, check, check. Yes, this person is qualified. Let's move them on and let the supervisor decide about how qualified they are specifically as a person, you know? So that is something to keep in mind. And remember that your resume is a fluid living document. You can change it. Its purpose is to get you an interview, and if it's not working, you can move things around, you can reformat it, you can come to Career Force and say, this is what's going on, this is the work I want, what can I do? And that's the kind of thing that we are very happy to help with. So to give an idea of how important the visuals of a resume are, we get to look at one of my favorite slides here, just because I think it's cool. What you're looking at is from theladders.com, and that website did a study using some very fancy software that showed the heat from a recruiter's eyeballs as they moved over to resumes. And so it looks like the chat might be working now, I think. And yes, it is. That's great. So very briefly in the chat, I know you can't really read what's on these two documents, but what do you notice both about how they're formatted and where that recruiter was looking? Just very briefly. So what do you notice about the one on the left versus the one on the right? Do we have any takers? Well, what you might notice as you're looking between these is that this document on the left has some pretty dense chunks of text. You may notice that where the recruiter was looking, they paid a lot of attention up toward the top, looking at the summary and that first bit of experience. And as things got more dense with the text, you see less and less color here until they did not even finish reading this document. And you know what we were saying earlier about big blocks of text that scream, I'm very boring, please skip me. This seems to be where we're at by the time we get to the bottom of this document. And so by formatting it in a way that makes these big chunks of text, it makes it harder for the eye to focus. And so it didn't. Something to keep in mind about the one on the right is that we see that the recruiter looked at a lot more of the document at this point. And they looked at it from top to bottom. They were very interested in education. They were interested in the summary and the first most recent position. And what you'll notice is that just even the visual shape of this resume, there are clear and separate sections. The text is a little bit more spaced out. There are some spots to breathe visually. And so that can help with focusing and with being able to quickly grab information that is necessary to decide if someone's qualified for a position. The one note that I would give this person for their resume is that their margins are itty bitty, and that can make it look sort of like a wall of text. And that can be a little harder to read. So I would recommend to them that they make those a little bit bigger and then it's a little bit more spaced out. But otherwise, you can see the difference in how much of that document that recruiter looked at. Another thing to keep in mind with resumes is that we want to make it scannable. And this is kind of a double meaning because many employers these days utilize applicant tracking software or applicant tracking systems, which would, if you're not familiar with that, that is software computer programs that will scan resumes for how well they match a job description. And in some cases, if that resume is not enough of a match, that computer system will just boot it right out before any human looks at it. And so you want to make sure that your resume is scannable and is making very clear how well it fits with that position. Once again, the importance of targeting. That said, many of the things that make a resume scannable for a computer system are also what make it scannable for a person. You don't want it to be too fancy with the font because sometimes that can be a little harder to read, both for machines and for eyeballs. You want to make sure that if you're going to make something emphasized, that you use bold or use capital letters. Italics can be a little harder to read. Underlines can sometimes gum things up and make things look cluttered. I mean, some of these may work for certain types of resumes, but if you want to make it as safe and scannable as possible, keep it simple. That makes it easier for people to read and easier for computers to read. If you are curious about applicant tracking software and how you can kind of navigate some of that, one thing you can do is do some research. When you are going to that job description or clicking apply on a company website, often that application will not be housed on that company's website. It won't be abccompany.com. It will go to the applicant tracking software's website. So if you've ever clicked one and seen ICIMS or I want to say Workday, something like that, then that is what that software is. So then you can Google that and see what you can find for tips. You can also use websites like jobscan.co to test how well your resume is matching. You can put in your resume, put in the job description, and then it will show that what percent match that is. They also have some great articles on that website about dealing with applicant tracking software. Ultimately, you just want to make sure that as you format your resume, you are not distracting from the content because the content is the important part, the message about relatable skills and work history that you're trying to convey. Speaking of content, let's talk about it. We want to make sure, number one, keep the resume honest and positive. You want to make sure that the resume content is accurate because inaccurate information could cost you your job later, and that's not a situation anybody wants. So keep it honest, keep it positive. If you are concerned about how you're going to tell the story of how you fit this position with your previous work history, set up an appointment. We can talk about it. And there are many ways that we can refocus or reformat the resume to shine the spotlight on your best skills and qualifications. You want the content to focus on your skills and things you've achieved or accomplished, not just tasks. You, whenever you can, want to provide results. That is really a big thing because that's what employers are interested in. What kind of results will you get us? You want to focus the resume on a particular job, a particular position, a particular occupation. Once again, if you try to include all of it, it can be a little harder for the employer to envision you in that position. And finally, targeting your resume to a specific job helps the employer see how qualified you are for that specific position and increases the likelihood you'll be called for an interview. So an example of targeting would be if you are applying for a job as a chef at a restaurant, you probably don't need to put your forklift skills on your resume unless you know from the job description that chefs also go into the back warehouse and use a forklift to get all the ingredients, which would be a very interesting job. But if it's not related, then you don't need to include it. Ultimately, for you, this is a marketing tool. For employers, it's a screening and elimination tool. So you want to provide all the reasons that they should not screen you out. Finally, whenever we talk about applicant tracking software and resumes, questions come up about keywords. And people have asked, well, what about this thing where I list off all the keywords from the resume and then I put it in white so they can't see it? Applicant tracking systems can see it. They'll notice the words, but then when the employer gets your resume, they'll be able to tell that you just kind of tried to put in that little cheat. Ultimately, what can work better is to speak the language of the job description and how you're talking about your experience. If I'm applying for a job as a trainer and currently I'm working as a facilitator, it's generally the same type of work. And so I can say I have training experience rather than speaking the language of the job I'm in, saying I have facilitating experience. Little things like that can go a long way. So let's talk about formats. So before I jump into that, Sheila, do we have any questions that have come up in the chat?
No questions at this time. I hope the chat's still working because it's pretty quiet.
Okay.
Can someone type something in the chat to let me
Yes.
know it's working?
Yes. If anyone could put like an exclamation point in the chat or anything like that just quickly so we can see that it's working, that'd be great. And if we don't see anything in a little bit here, then maybe Sheila see what we can do about getting it
We'll do
resolved.
some more troubleshooting.
Okay.
I don't see anything coming in, so I'm
Oh dear.
assuming it's not working. Okay, thank you.
Our apologies, folks. We're gonna get it resolved as quickly as we can. So we're gonna talk format now. We'll talk first about some basics of formatting that are pretty universal to a lot of resumes, and then we'll zoom in on a few different styles and what can work best for a given situation. So, for some basics, you'd want to make sure you're choosing a format that best presents your skills relative to the job description. That top 1/3 of your page is key. If the employer does not look at any other part of your resume, they're very likely going to look at that top third. So you want to make sure that the most important information is up there, right in that top 1/3 of your resume, so that if they don't see anything else, they see the most important parts. The way that many people do that will be to put their intention at the top, which could be a summary statement. You saw on some of the previous resume examples. That was the very first thing. Or a profile, or a professional title, or an objective. Those all are kind of under the umbrella of an intention. And so by putting that at the top, then you're making sure that if nothing else is seen, that is. That's where you want to grab the employer's attention. I talked a little bit earlier about white space, offering some breathing room. And it's not literal breathing room, but visual breathing room. That can make it a lot easier for an employer to see and actually take in what is on your resume. You want to utilize bullet points that can help get away from kind of big paragraphs or chunks of text. And we talked about margins a little bit. Generally, you want them to be between a 1/2 inch and an inch. If it's more than an inch, then it's kind of like that resume on the left from that eyeball scanning page where it kind of looks like a column and it all ends up smooshed together. If they are smaller than a 1/2 inch, then it can look like a great big wall of text, and that can also be a little bit harder to read. With fonts, you don't want to make them too small. Don't worry about making your resume only one page. You can make it two, but you don't want to shrink your font so small that it's hard to read because that can distract from the content of your resume. You don't want the one thing the employer remembers to be how much of a headache they got from trying to read the tiny writing on your resume. So keep it certainly no smaller than size 10. I'd recommend size 12 or around there, just to make sure that it is easy enough to read. Also, you don't need to include something that had previously been pretty common to include. At the very bottom of the resume, a lot of people have learned to put references available upon request. That used to be very common. These days, it's not really expected or trendy in resume fashion. It's implied that you'll provide references if you are asked, so you don't need to use space on your resume for that. If they do request references right away, which isn't super common, but they do sometimes, you don't need to put them on your resume. Rather, they would probably be best put on their own document so that you can submit, here are my references, here's my resume, here's my cover letter. But most likely, you will not be asked for references until later on in the process, and I would recommend you don't need to send anything until you are asked. So now we are going to zoom in on 3 different kind of common styles of resume format, and they work well for different situations. No matter which one you use, you still want to make sure that you are keeping it focused on the type of work you want to do. But I'm going to try to kind of go briefly through each one of these and explain why it works for that person's situation. So, number 1, this style of resume will probably look pretty familiar to you because it is quite a traditional one. It's called a chronological resume. And the idea of a chronological resume is that you start with your most recent experience, and then the one before that, and then the one before that, etc. And this is a great resume format for people who have a consistent employment history, or if you are applying for a job very similar to the type of work that you've been doing recently, and your recent work history is consistent with your career goals. And so, as you can see here, Mr. Robert Doyle, in his summary, introduces himself as a production assembler. He highlights skills and expertise, many of which are related to production assembly. His employment history shows his most recent position as a production assembler, and before that, a different kind of production assembler. And his education is also focused on soldering, which is a form of assembly. So his whole resume is singing the same song about production assembly. and making it very clear, I am a good fit for this assembly position because I have done it before and recently. And so that's where Robert is shining the spotlight on his most recent experience. And so this can be, like I said, a great opportunity if you're staying in your field, if it's kind of a natural next step. Some things that you want to keep in mind is you probably don't want to use more than 10 to 15 years of work history as far as going into detail, or you can use your last 3 jobs. But if you go back farther than that, then you can start to date yourself, and it can also make the resume quite long if you've had a long work history. And so there are ways to go about honoring some of that expertise and that experience without going into as much detail. I'll talk about that shortly. But this is a chronological resume. For those who may be early in their career and are looking to establish work experience, maybe you're in that frustrating situation of, I want a job so I can build experience, but I can't get a job unless I have experience. This might be a better option for you. This would be a functional resume, sometimes called a skills-based resume. And what you can see here is that we still start with an objective and with qualifications, but instead of jumping straight into previous work experience, because the person might not have that current work experience, it goes into accomplishments. And I see the chat is working. That's amazing. So if you have been holding on to questions, please feel free to submit them. Uh, so instead of going into the, like I said, instead of going into a previous work experience, it goes into accomplishments. And so what do we mean by accomplishments? The really nice thing about this section is that it's very customizable to the type of work that you are applying for. So if you're looking at a job description and they talk a whole lot about customer service and you have some customer service experience or skills, that can be your number one skill set. So you can say, here's my customer service experience. And then you can, in the bullet points, go into details about your skills and accomplishments from that particular area. If they highlight a certain type of computer software that is very important to the type of position, that can be a skill set. And you can talk about what have you done using that software? What have you accomplished using that software? What outcomes did you get? And so on. So you can really customize it and focus it. And the nice thing is that the skills don't have to all be from one experience or even from a paid experience. It can be that you built these skills while you were volunteering and you built these skills in a class that you took and so on. And then down toward the bottom, there is a little information about where some of these skills might have come from, just kind of here and there. And so it can be beyond just a paid position. It can go into, for example, here, activity, camp, training, a seminar, a class, any kind of degree program or certificate program. So this can be a really nice option for somebody early in their career because instead of shining the spotlight on here's my recent work experience, because it would not be necessarily be shining the spotlight on much, then you shine the spotlight on I'm a good fit for this position because I have skills that can transfer. And then it is putting the skills and experience in the best light. So if you are thinking, well, I am looking for a different type of work than I've done before, but I'm not at the beginning of my career, I have previous experience, then you might want to think about a combination resume, which puts those two types together. And so what you see on a combination resume is that we start once again with a summary or an intention. And then again, you go into selected skills and experience or accomplishments. And so what you see here, what Susan does is in her summary, she introduces herself as an experienced security professional. Her selected skills and experience are focused on building and personnel security, emergency management, prevention, leadership, customer service, all skills that are very common for security positions. We can probably guess that she is applying for a security position. And here's where things get interesting. If you go down to the employment history, then we do list previous employment and the dates. And what you see, she previously was an infantryman in the US Army, a valet, and a bartender. What don't we see? A security position. She has not worked specifically as a security professional before, but by the time we get down there, she has made such a strong case for her skills in different areas that are related to security that it doesn't seem as important that she hasn't had that specific role because look what she's bringing to the table. And so, and we have education toward the bottom as well. Fire sciences, if If you are a security person for a building, it's great if you know how to deal with a fire. So this is a great opportunity to use this combination resume if you are looking to move into a different field than you have been in, or if there are some gaps in your resume and you are wanting to tell the story of how well your skills can fit the position. This shines the spotlight similarly to the skills-based resume on I'm a good fit for this position because my skills transfer. Susan's skills transfer. And that is what makes this resume effective for her situation. All right. So before I jump any further, do we have any questions now that the chat is once again working?
So we did have one question come in now.
Mhm.
Um, so someone wants to know, do I mix in special projects I did, with my core job responsibilities, or is it better to separate those into different sections?
I think it depends largely on the job description. If it really specifies that you highlight projects or that you have skills in project work or have done certain things with project work, you might want to make it separate. But if it is not really specifying that and it's just asking for the experience that you had in that previous position, then I think you could integrate that with the kind of work history entry for that. Um, that I think, yeah, it ultimately comes down to that job description, but neither of those is a bad format. It just, you want to make a decision about where you want the spotlight to be. What do you want to highlight? And how much do you want to highlight the projects versus how important is it that they were projects related to this role? So that's the wordy answer to the question, but I hope that helps out with it. Okay, well, we will keep on rolling then. So we've talked about a few different formats. And once again, if you are interested in any of those and are thinking, okay, how do I translate my experience into that format? Set up an appointment with your career force office. That we love doing that. That's our thing. So now we've focused on that. We are going to break this down now into some basic resume parts. And since I hope the chat is still working, I would love to see what do you remember about from those three resumes? Were there any sections that all three of them had, even though they were different from each other? So if you can think of a section or yeah, a category or section of your resume of all three of those formats that all of them had, would you go ahead and put that in the chat?
Okay, I'm guessing the chat went out again because I see
No.
nothing. So I'm gonna
Okay.
I'm gonna check it again.
Okay.
We
Well,
apologize for the problems with the chat.
and I appreciate any of you who are attempting to engage with my audience participation here. I appreciate you. We will keep moving. So some basic resume parts. What you might have noticed that all of those different formats had, they all had an intention, some kind of summary or objective toward the top. They all had some kind of work history, whether that was paid or not. They all had an education section. And of course, at the top, they all had a contact information block. And so we're going to zoom in on a few of these. So those four are kind of the core sections that you would like your resume to have, no matter what you're doing with the format. So with the contact information block, some good tips for that. You want to make sure you're using your full name, try to avoid nicknames. You want to potentially remove the street address. That's a little newer. Previously, it was just kind of accepted that everybody would put their full address at the top of their resume. In this case, these days it's considered it might be a security concern if somebody at the office is carrying a pile of resumes and they comically run into somebody and papers go flying everywhere and someone picks up that resume, they now have all of your contact information instead of just most of it. You still will be able to get that application information to, or you'll be able to get the contact information to the employer by putting it in the application. It will likely be required, but that's a lot more secure. So that is something to keep in mind. Is perfectly acceptable on your resume to just put city and state, and that works out just fine. As a best practice, we encourage job seekers to pick one phone number. I know you might be thinking, oh, I'm making it more convenient. So if they don't reach me on this first number, they can call me at the second one. that can be confusing to the employer, because they might go, well, which one's the right one? Which one's the best one? So what I'd recommend is just include one, make sure that that's the one that you'll answer most of the time. And it's likely going to be your cell phone. You don't necessarily need to put that it is a cell phone, like cell in a parentheses or anything like that. They'll assume. Also, I would be curious, and this is a hypothetical question, but make sure you think about it. When is the last time you listened to your voicemail recording? And do you know what it says? If the answer is a long time ago, or I have no idea what it says, I hope it's good, I would recommend going into your voicemail and giving it a listen and making sure that it still represents you the way you'd like to represent yourself to employers. You want to keep it professional. The things I have heard on voicemail recordings over the years, that we've had songs that have lasted the entire 4 minutes that thing can be. I have been jostled around in somebody's pocket for 4 minutes, and or maybe it was two. Either way, a long time. And I spent the whole time wondering if they accidentally answered while this was still in their bag, or was this the voice recording? That was their recording. And I've heard some things that have been less than professional as well. So, whatever it is, you want to make sure that it's something that you are comfortable with employers hearing. And so, make sure that you are aware of it, it's representing you well. Same thing with the email address. You want to keep it professional, ideally, some version of your name. That does not mean that if you have your favorite personal email address, groovygirl2005@hotmail.com, and you want to keep using that, that you have to get rid of it. You don't. But I would recommend potentially creating your own new email address specifically for your job search. It can help declutter things as well, just because sometimes in a job search you can get an awful lot of emails. And so that can be a way to have it all in one place so that it's easier for you to check and make sure that you're not missing anything from employers. And so you want that email address, like I said, to be some version of your name. And also try to avoid numbers that appear to be the year of your birth, even if they're not. So if it's 19 something or 20 something, and you have 4 digits there at the end, the employer might even unconsciously assume that that is your birth date. And now they have an unconscious assumption about your age, which could lead to some unconscious bias about age. You want to just try and avoid that whole domino effect if possible. So if either make it 3 letters, numbers, or just try to make sure that it's not something that resembles a birth year. That just can simplify things a little bit. And finally, if you have a LinkedIn account that is active and up to date, feel free to include a link to that profile. That's just one more way that employers can learn about you and get an idea of what you're bringing to the table. Next, let's talk intention, which could be an objective or a summary. That is something that, like I said, is very important. You want to have it toward the top of each resume that you are sending out. And you want to, like everything else on the resume, keep it focused. Why are you interested in this position? Why, as you are putting in your summary, you want to highlight the pieces of your professional skill set and history that are going to be meaningful for the position you're applying for. And you want to avoid kind of being wordy for the sake of being wordy. It's very common. You might often see seeking a challenging position with a growing company. And that is a perfectly fine sentence to say, but it also does not provide a lot of information about, well, what are you bringing to the table? What do you know about this position? How do you match this position? And so keep that in mind that you want to keep it focused. So you want another thing about that, by the way, is that if you only focus on what you're seeking, that's very me oriented. And again, doesn't give the employer any information other than I want. And so when you are thinking about that, you can say I want. You can say that you're seeking a certain type of position. Ideally, you'd like that to be a specific position or job title, ideally the one you're applying for. But you also want to pair that with not just I want, but I bring, I offer. So seeking a position in this industry offering expertise in A, B, and C, and a record of always doing this thing really well, or always operating with the best interests of the company or the customer, etc., in mind. So if there is an I want, try and pair it with an I offer. Next, we will talk about the work history section, which is going to look different on a chronological resume versus a skills-based or a combination. But on a chronological resume, you want to list your most recent employment first and determine how far back you should go. I think I glimpsed a question in the chat, and I get this question a lot of, well, I worked at this employer for 14 years, 20 years, 30 years. Do I need to put my top 3 still? And not necessarily. It will depend on your situation as well. Because if you worked for the employer for a couple decades, but you had different job titles during that time, and you gained responsibility over time, there you can break that down under the kind of the umbrella of that employer. Somebody at any one of the staff at the career force offices can kind of sit down with you and talk through how to do that. And so you can break that down to show you've had all these different positions, and you don't necessarily need to continue adding on. Another thing that I can just briefly touch on now is that if you have older experience but is still relevant and still experience that you want to honor on your resume, you can create another small section called additional relevant experience. And there, in 2 or 3 sentences, no more, you can kind of summarize your collective experience that's older than what you have detailed. So that way, you're not tying it to a specific company necessarily. You're not tying it to a specific date range, but you can state expertise in this type of work and this type of work, or previous experience in job title, job title, and job title. Its skills or expertise includes A, B, and C. Software utilized include, or equipment utilized, etc. Whatever is relevant to you. So that way you're bringing it all together. You're still saying, and I also have this experience. Ask me about it later, you know? So that can be a good way to include some of the older experience without putting as much emphasis on it so that you're not dating yourself. Other things to keep in mind is that for professional experience, you can include volunteer experience if that is applicable. Just want to make sure you're indicating that properly. Oops, I'm going backwards. All right, likewise, you can see that for a skills-based resume or combination resume, that's where you would want to really make friends with that job description. I mean, it should be your best friend when you're applying for it, no matter what, but especially during this, when you are creating a resume in this format, because the categories of qualifications that you decide on, you want them to have a conversation with that job description. So that is something to keep in mind. Look at the job description, determine what seems to be most important, what categories of skills or tasks are most important that I also have. And then that's how you can decide on your categories. And finally, education. First thing to note, if you have any college, even if you took one class in college, you don't need to list your high school diploma. It can be assumed then that since you have post-secondary experience that you have a high school diploma or equivalent, so you don't need to include it there. When it comes to education section, it's a little different from the work history section in that the dates are optional on the resume. Might you still need to include that information on the application? Perhaps. But for the resume, your marketing tool, then you want to make sure that you are keeping things focused. If a piece of education is more than maybe 5 years old, you don't need to include the date. Don't worry about it. Because it can not only suggest your age, it can also suggest how current your academic knowledge is. And just because you got a degree a while back, that doesn't mean that you don't know what you're doing with it anymore. You may have used those skills very consistently throughout your career, but you just don't want it to suggest that when that is not the case. So get those dates out of there. They don't need to be there. That can be even more recent, more recent education, you can take the dates off if you're in a field that is kind of constantly changing. I know this can be the case for fields like the IT field where every couple years what you need to know has changed. And so that's something to keep in mind. Just like on a chronological resume, the work history, you start with the most recent position first, start with your most recent education first, on whatever format you use. I've seen a lot, for some reason, someone will go their work history from newest to oldest, and then they'll put their education from oldest to newest. You want to keep it consistent if you can. And if the targeted position, what you're applying for, is not related to your major or the subject that you studied, you don't need to include the subject. You can just state that you got an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, whatever it is, some college coursework. And that's fine. You don't need to go into it unless it's related to the position, and then go for it, because then you're showing one more way that you are qualified for that position. All right. So, as far I see a couple questions about education. If you just have a high school diploma, then go ahead, put it on there. You can put your graduation year, and so definitely include that. If you don't have post-secondary experience education, then definitely include the high school diploma or equivalent if you've got it. And then had if you had a college experience but you didn't end up completing a degree at that time, then a good way to put that might be so for example, business coursework or bachelor's degree coursework or something like that as what you did, and then the name of the school. And you can, if you want to put the years, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But that's what I'd recommend if you haven't completed it. Just blank name of what you were studying, coursework. Um, as far as other resume sections go, there's a whole list up here. You can see that there are many other sections you can include that will be depending on what makes sense for you. You want to list any, if you're a member of any organizations that are related to the position you're applying for, cool, throw them in there. You want to include awards, recognition, or hobbies or things like that only if they are related to the position. That's the refrain here. Include it if it's related to the position. Military experience, that's your work experience, so certainly include that as well. But others, you want to just make sure that it is focused, and be cautious of including any affiliations that could be polarizing. If you worked on a political campaign for a candidate, if you worked or part of a religious organization, certainly there's nothing wrong with either of those things. But if you want to take the cue from the position that you're applying for and the employer you're applying for. If you are applying for a political organization or a religious organization, that could really help boost you up. But if you feel like it could be controversial, could get in the way, then you don't necessarily need to include it unless it is directly related to what you are wanting to do. All right, we have about 10 minutes, minus 1 minute to go through accomplishment statements, because I've mentioned that term previously. So let me get into what I mean by accomplishment statements. First of all, where do accomplishment statements go? Generally, they go on the bullet points of your resume. So remember, we talked about skills oriented versus task oriented. You want to avoid just listing your tasks whenever possible. You want to make them accomplishment statements. And what makes an accomplishment statement is that you are putting these three things together: action words, details, and outcome or result. Sometimes I even like to put that in a different order and put the result first. Um, Increased customer base by 50% by doing this, this, and this, using skills in A, B, and C. Suddenly, you're not just saying called customers. You are saying, this is what I did, and here's how well I did it, and here was the results. That gives an employer a much clearer picture of what they get when they hire you. When we talk about action words, if you Google resume action words, you will be showered with results. There are a lot of lists out there of action words that you can use. And so there are a lot of great ones. Try to avoid repeating them. If you have 4 bullet points in a row that say managed or assisted with, that can be challenging for the employer to keep reading through. It can start to feel kind of redundant. So you want to make sure that you are varying that when you can. Um, Other things that you can do are to avoid phrases like responsibilities included or responsible for. Perhaps you were responsible for this task. However, whenever possible, try to just take that out. Instead of saying responsible for supervising A, B, and C, put supervised A, B, and C. And the reason for that is that if you perhaps you know someone who has been responsible for a certain job and they have not done it very well. That's a thing to keep in mind. You can be responsible for something, and that does not say anything about how well you do it. So banish that from your resume. Just focus on not just what I was responsible for. Here's what I did. Here is what I did. And here's how well I did it. So we're going to do a very short activity here because I want to be mindful of everybody's time. But what I'm going to do on this next slide, there will be two tasks listed. And I would encourage you to pull up a little blank word processing document or grab a paper and pencil or something. And so these two tasks will be listed. And so what I ask you to do is to try out making an accomplishment statement out of them. And I'm just going to put them right up here. This will involve using your imagination a little bit because if you haven't done that type of work before, then you would be thinking, well, what does success look like for this? But it doesn't have to be anything perfect. I would just like to see a couple in the chat because it looks like it's working. Please let it keep working. Then I go ahead and give it a try. What would be an accomplishment statement way of saying kept inventory? What would be an accomplishment statement way of saying called customers? I cheated on that one a little bit for you, so you feel free. But as you work and as you start submitting some of those to the chat, I'm going to review some basic accomplishment statement stuff. So ultimately, you want to focus on here's what I bring to the table and here's why it's valuable. And some ways that you can do that are in your details. You can try including numbers, quantifying things. Remember when we said increased customer base by 50%? That gives a very concrete example of the value that you brought. So things that you can ask yourself when you're trying to think what details to add. Who was involved in this task, in this project? What was the project? When, at what point did this happen during, like, was I helping with this project or leading this project when we were in the middle of complex change in the company where I was working? Was this during a staff transition? Was this during a restructuring? Um, what kind of situation did you demonstrate the skills? What kind of project was it? Why was it you? How often were you doing this? How well were you doing it? How many of these things did you do? What was included in this type of work? What kind of system or software were you using? What equipment? What tool? And so on. So you can really get your mind going as you're thinking some of those journalist questions. If you were interviewing yourself about what you did with that project or how you used that skill, that can be a really helpful way to make it an accomplishment statement and really use it to show how you shine. And I am seeing a couple of great examples in the chat. Yes, inventory levels were kept at a not consistent 98.9% level. Yes, well done. And Suzanne ensured total customer satisfaction and maintained friendly relationships to keep customers happy and loyal. Beautiful. Yes. And so those are a couple of examples of how you can turn a task into an accomplishment. These are other examples that for kept inventory. If you change it to manage daily inventory of over 1,000 classifications of medical supplies, you are going from providing one piece of information to providing this is what I did. This is how many I was working with. This is the type of supplies I was working with. So now instead of saying one thing with that bullet point, you're saying three things in about 10 words. Same deal with calling customers. You go from saying one thing, this is what I did, to grew client base. This was an outcome that I got. From 0 to 70, this is how well I did that. Within 2 months, this is how fast I did that. By effectively using cold call techniques, this is how I did that. So that's four very valuable pieces of information in about 15 words. And so those are some examples of how changing how you talk about the work that you did can really show yourself in a very in the light of expertise. So any questions before we go into the home stretch, the 3 minutes of cover letter time? All right.
Yeah, just
Oh,
one,
is there one?
quick question. Yeah, someone
Sure.
wants to know if you could tell them a little more about a resume link for a 25-year career with several progressive roles at 3 different companies.
Sure. I mean, my number one piece of advice is to set up a one-on-one appointment so it can be really individual to you. But I think that still, ideally, you want to go back not more than 10 to 15 years in detail. If you have a position that goes from like 9 years ago to 20 years ago, so be it. But then I think that you can still lay that out and definitely break down your progressive roles in those previous positions to show that you gained increasing responsibility over time. But yes, that would be a great opportunity to connect with the Career Force Center and to really sit down with somebody to talk through here's what it is and here is how can I lay this out specifically. All right, so home stretch, we are going to very briefly talk cover letters, the more controversial friend of the resume. And I say controversial because there are people out there who would say cover letters are completely obsolete. No one looks at them, don't worry about it. While there are others who would say cover letters are necessary, you should do it every single time, they're very important. And the answer is somewhere in between. Uh, there are some employers that will be looking at a cover letter, some who don't prioritize them as much. But since there is no way for us to know which type of employer we are applying for, generally, best practice, if there is an option to include a cover letter, include it. If there's not an option to include it, okay, then you don't need to go out of your way. But if even if it's optional, if there's a spot for a cover letter, make sure you have one ready to go. And so some very quick tips for that. You want to use the same name and contact information block as on your resume. Anyone who attended last week's creative job search will remember that this is branding. And ultimately, that just means you want to make your resume and your cover letter, those two documents, look like they're going to the same party. They belong to the same person. So keep that same name and contact information block. Whenever possible, try to address it to a specific person. But if you can't find a name, then you can say, dear hiring manager, you can say to the blank company name, hiring team, etc. You want to keep that cover letter targeted. You don't want it to be a form letter that you send to everybody. And remember that this is a chance to write in full sentences, unlike the resume. You don't want it to be only a kind of a paragraph version of your resume because that's very repetitive. It's your opportunity to talk about why are you interested in this position? What what is important about it to you? What brings you here? How have you demonstrated how well you have done some of these skills? And also, very quick tip, try to avoid starting too many sentences with I or my. It's a very easy trap to fall into because you're talking about you, but it can be really repetitive to read. So there are a few more tips on here. I will not go deeply into them because we are past time already and I want to let you get back to your day. But ultimately, you want to keep your cover letters short, to the point, and easily skimmed, just like the resume. It does not need to be a novel. Ideally, no more than 3 paragraphs, no more than 3 to 5 sentences each. You want to identify or indicate how you're going to follow up with the employer whenever possible. And you want to make sure you do it if you say you're going to do it as well. Um, if you are asked to indicate salary requirements, then do that in a range. Usually you won't be asked to do that in the cover letter, but just in case, provide a range and we can talk through how to find out some of that information. Just go ahead and set an appointment. And of course, proofread it, edit, zero mistakes. So that is a wrap. I appreciate you staying an extra minute with me here and for bearing with us as we had some chat box adventures. I'm glad it's working now. But I saw that there might have been a few more questions in the chat, and I would encourage you to set up an appointment so that you can get those questions answered. If with whatever Career Force office is close to you, um, you can find that on our website. And so we love helping out with these things. So please do feel free to set up an appointment. And thank you all so much for joining us. Like Sheila said, there will be an email that will go out by the end of the day tomorrow that will have the slides, the speaker notes, a link to a recording of this workshop, and some additional helpful supplemental materials that can help follow up on some of the things we talked about today. So that will be coming your way. But thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.